Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our very first online career panel for Let's Talk Science volunteers. My name is Jenna Freed, and I work on the Let's Talk Science outreach team as a program support coordinator. Let's Talk Science is a national charitable organization committed to inspiring and empowering Canadian youth to develop the skills they need to participate and thrive in an ever-changing world. To accomplish this, Let's Talk Science offers a comprehensive suite of science, technology, engineering, and math-based programs to support youth, educators, and volunteers across Canada. The Let's Talk Science Outreach program can be found at over 40 universities and colleges across Canada, connecting educators and youth with outstanding volunteers to deliver a wide variety of meaningful STEM activities for children as young as 3 years old and youth up to grade 12, all free of charge. Our network of volunteers also includes those connected through our web-based program, Curiosity, that connects students and teachers with the STEM community, offering an interactive and reliable place for youth ages 13 to 17 to explore and engage in STEM issues using technologies and relevant contexts that appeal to them. Last year, in our annual volunteer survey, we asked our volunteers what kinds of professional development topics interested them the most, and near the top of the list was career preparation. Are located all across the country, we thought that a virtual event would be the best way to reach as many of our volunteers as possible. As this is the first event of its kind, we'd really love to get your feedback. So there's a link in the description of this video to a survey for you to complete so that we can make any future professional development events as relevant and effective for you as possible. So any and all feedback is greatly appreciated. We have a few questions that were submitted by volunteers in advance, but we'll also be taking live questions. So please use the chat box on the YouTube live stream to submit a question, and we'll try to get to it as soon as we can. So without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome our panelists today who will be sharing their personal stories, advice, and insight into a variety of different STEM careers. So to get us started, I'll just ask each of our panelists to tell us a bit about yourself, your educational background, and the position that you are currently in. So why don't we start with you, Hilary?
Oh, you caught me off guard. I was still on mute. My name's Hilary Foulkes. I live in Calgary. It's actually snowing like crazy out here today. My background from an educational perspective was growing up in the West Island of Montreal and going to elementary and high school there. And then I went to university at the University of Waterloo in Southern Ontario. Took earth science, and so I'm a geologist by background. And I've been in various forms of the business, and that goes from actually, in the field and doing mapping and looking at rocks to executive roles. And now I serve on a number of boards. So this is after about 40 years of being in the industry. So I'm very much in the latter stages of my career rather than the very early ones.
Great, thanks, Hilary. How about Dan? We go to you next.
Okay, my name is Dan. I am a science communicator for a living. So I have an undergrad from the University of Alberta. That's my hometown, Edmonton. A master's from York and a PhD from Cornell. I was doing a postdoc at Brown University, working on bat biomechanics. I'm interested in how bats move. And I started getting these opportunities to do little TV things with companies in the States. And they went well. And then I started appearing on talk shows to talk about science, like Craig Ferguson and Jay Leno and Dr. Oz and these other ones. And it was all really super weird. And then Jay Ingram was stepping down at Daily Planet. So they asked me if I would interview for that. And I said yes, because what would you say if you were asked that? And I got the job. So now for 5 years, I've been the co-host with Zaya Tong of Daily Planet on Discovery. I co-host that. I'm also the host of a show in the States called Monsters Inside Me, which is about parasites. I wrote a book called Mother Nature is Trying to Kill You, which argues that the most beautiful parts of nature are the most disgusting parts of nature, which is something I actually believe. And recently I've started a podcast, which is sort of a new way of reaching people with science stuff. It's called Recent Paper, Decent Puzzle. And I use that to, I pick a paper that I like, a recent paper, and I just try to explain it like I would to my friends who maybe aren't trained as scientists. And so far that's been really rewarding. I've gotten good feedback on that, but it's the latest thing that I've been doing to sort of push my limits in terms of what I'm comfortable with. And so I've always been interested in science outreach. I've always thought it would be the thing I did on the side, but somehow it became the main thing I do. But I still try to do a little bit of science on the side. So I live in Toronto now, and I really like what I'm doing, and I'm happy to answer questions about it.
Great. Thanks, Dan. The podcast is great. I recommend people listening to it.
Thanks. Thank you.
So next, how about we go to Karen?
Great. Okay. Well, I think my early beginnings of interest in science actually started as I was growing up and spending a lot of time in a ravine behind my house. So was an early zoologist and botanist, and that's, I think, where a lot of my interest developed. And then I went to University of Guelph. I did 3 degrees there, Bachelor's of Science, a Master's of Science, and a PhD, all in zoology, ending off really focusing on fish and how they grow and how hormones influence their growth as well. As I graduated from my PhD, I just had my son, and so I took a leave of absence from my academic path, and I took a job with a local organization so I could be close to home, and which was really focused on doing environmental and social justice work, but doing public interest research. And so one of my roles there was connecting students at the University of Guelph with real projects that they could work in the community on and get course credit for it at the same time. So they were making a difference as well as getting their academic work done. And so one thing led to the other. I started to get more engaged in the community. I went to more public meetings so I could learn about potential projects. I met a lot of very active citizens who were making a difference in their community. And then I decided to run for local council and was successful. And so I did 6 years as a city councillor and then 11 years as mayor. And I would say the sort of 2 big themes for me was sustainability and citizen engagement, engaging the community and local decision making. And you know, while that might be an unusual path for someone with a science background, I actually think we probably need more people in science in politics. We hear a lot about evidence-based policy today, and in the wake of fake news and alternative facts that we hear, not just in the US, but in Canada as well, and the struggle for science to have a place in policy making. I think even though it was untraditional, I hope it becomes a very traditional path for some people who have a science background.
Okay, thanks, Karen. And Daryl, why don't you finish us off with this first question, an introduction?
Sure. So my name is Daryl Dominique. My kind of career in science started at a very young age when I wanted to just build things. It started kind of with Lego, but I kept promising myself that one day I'd build a spaceship. That was before I knew the laws of physics. Since then, I've run through mechanical engineering as my educational background. So I've got a specialization in mechatronics. And then things kind of took a turn towards the entrepreneurial side. So in 3rd year of my degree, me and a few colleagues started a company to do 3D design, 3D printing, basically help small startups, help individual inventors turn sort of their concepts and ideas into real world physical products, which wound up being, I think, the most pivotal point in my life, because we've worked on projects everywhere from point of care health monitoring devices to was meant to monitor the health of the oceans or bodies of water that they're in, to trophies for local events and as seen on TV equivalent products. So it's fun having sort of experience all over the map in regards to what we're building. While doing that, I had a brief stint working with blasting and explosives to try and get myself into field work and see how much I liked, you know, the travel and working kind of in these areas that are in the middle of nowhere. And then most recently last year, I started another startup. I had built a mechanical sensor that could identify whether or not certain machines were failing at pivotal points, so like the nut and bolt fasteners, areas like that. And we extended that up to like a large IoT system. So I got to do an investment pitch for that, which was successful and kind of changed my career path again. So that's sort of been my last year. And then finally, to cap it all off, I was lucky enough to get get invited to my program at the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, which is examining sort of the social impacts of kind of upcoming areas of technology or upcoming social trends. And me and my specific team are working on the problem of artificial intelligence, what that might mean for our society in the future, and how we can better create a platform of understanding and conversation so that when this stuff does come up, we're not blindsided by it. And I think that's kind of a quick encapsulation of me so far.
Great, thanks Daryl and everyone. So we're gonna jump into the questions. Just a reminder to anyone watching this live that you can put any questions you have in the chat box and we'll try to address them as soon as we can. So the first question that I'm going to ask is from James, who pre-submitted this question. He asks, what pushed you to look outside the standard academia and industry? Was it an opportunity that presented itself, or were you actively looking for a different way to use your education? So Hilary, we'll start with you again.
You know, I am one of those people where I didn't really have a plan. And so when I started at university, it was after many, many years of thinking I was going to go into medicine and then taking my first geology course at the University of Waterloo and getting lost in it. So at the time, this was many, many years ago, almost 40 years ago, you know, I needed to get a job when I finished studying earth science and was a bona fide geologist. And so it was really just a question of, here are the companies that are hiring, here are the skills that they're looking for, and go do it. So I don't think it was terribly thoughtful, to be quite honest. It was opportunistic. And in those days, going and working in very remote areas, certainly, you know, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, but, you know, there was a lot of helicopter activity to get to work every day and living in tents and living with some very interesting people with varying degrees of education. And so that was, you know, that was a foundation that just happened, I would say, kind of by opportunistic means, but also a little bit of chance associated with it. When once I started down that path, it became clear to me how companies make money, how people invest in the stock market, and how the grassroots literally affects the profitability of companies. So whether you're a teacher and you have a pension plan invested, or whether you are a Canadian citizen and you're paying into your Canada pension plan, all of that money gets invested in companies that deliver returns. And so at some early stage, I think I recognized that literally the work in the subsurface had an impact on people's investments and ultimately, you know, their retirement. And so there was a transition there where it went from being purely technical to looking at the implication of that technical work in a business sense.
Awesome. Sounds like a very exotic place to be in these remote mines. And I think a lot of students will agree that it's easy to think you're going to have a plan, but it maybe isn't what happens when the graduation day comes around.
Yeah, it kind of evolves. And I'm not sure that tents in northern Saskatchewan actually is exotic, but it's definitely different.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how about Dan, we'll go to you next. What made you look outside the standard academia and industry route?
Well, every single time I think I know which direction I'm taking my career, I'm wrong. It keeps going in a different direction. So I got my undergrad and then I got a job at a publishing company in Edmonton. And my friend said, you should apply for a scholarship for grad school just in case. Now, at that point, I was already in love with bats, but I didn't see myself as somebody that could do grad school or that should do grad school. Definitely not one of the smarty pantses, right? Like I can get school done, but I'm not by any stretch. And so I applied for the scholarship. I got it. I remember one of my profs saying, you have the worst grades of anybody I've ever seen get an NSERC. And I still don't know if that was a nice thing he said to me or a mean thing he said to me, but I guess it doesn't matter, right? It's just what you do with it. So I did a master's with the guy that wrote the first book I'd ever read on bats, a guy named Brock Fenton. I went to York to work with him. And like he took me to Costa Rica and Belize, and I was seeing bats with suction cups on their wrists and ankles, and I just loved it. I mean, I was seeing vampire bats. It was the greatest experience. It was 2 years, I thought, okay, same thing. Like, I don't see myself as somebody who should do a PhD. So I'll get my master's, and then maybe I'll do outreach. Maybe I'll be a teacher. I don't know. Maybe I'll go and teach school. I don't know. So I got my master's. I moved to Victoria, because where else would you want to live in Canada? And I tried to get jobs, and I worked for a little while at Camosun College, and I just could not get my foot in the door for a job that would keep going. It was just a temporary position. So I ended up being a waiter. And there I was with a master's degree, and I was a waiter, and every time I had a table, I would be telling them about bats and about vampire bats and about this trip I took to Belize. And it's not what you want your waiter to tell you. So it was clear that I needed to get back into the game. And so the advice that I give a lot of people who are thinking about grad school, and the advice that sort of I took, was I did a PhD on bats, because that's what I thought would be the most fun thing to do then. Living in a tent in northern Saskatchewan would be fun. But that wasn't the fun that I wanted. So I did the fun where I got to go to Trinidad and go to New Zealand and catch bats that nobody'd seen before, and put them on treadmills and videotape them with a high-speed camera. And I mean, it was just like so fun. And I didn't really put a lot of thought into what was coming at the end. But at some point along the road, along my PhD, I started to realize that I had the skills that you needed to be a professor, that I was building that skill set. So professor was the obvious direction I was going. I finished my PhD. I got a postdoc, because that was the obvious next step. I got a postdoc that was fun, but it wasn't that fun. Like I didn't want to stay there forever. But I just was looking for that next job as a prof. And I had an interview at one place, and I remember leaving that thinking, I have to change my whole career. This is not what I want at all. I didn't get that job, and I wouldn't have taken it if it were offered to me. And then I got an interview at another place, and I was really excited about where the school was and the opportunity to bring diverse students from a bunch of socioeconomic backgrounds into the science fold. And so I decided that was going to be where I landed. So I accepted a job there, and I was in that 1 year between when you're a postdoc and when you start your job. And that's when the TV stuff took off. And then all of a sudden I got this offer from up here in Canada. And so then I bailed on the job that I had in the States. They still haven't responded to that email where I told them I wasn't coming, because they're pretty mad. And then I came to Canada. So I sort of have, it was when I thought I wanted to be doing outreach that I ended up going back into academics. And it was when I thought I was going to be a prof that I ended up getting an outreach job. So right now I kind of think I know what's going on, but I never do. I just always focus on taking the path that right now feels fun, because at no point has there ever been a dangling prize that if you put in the time with your PhD, that day you walk across the stage is going to be, everything's going to work that from then on. It doesn't work like that. If you get depressed and you feel like your PhD is the wrong place to be, it is the wrong place to be. So anyway, it's a similar thing. I don't think you can ever know where your path is going to take you exactly, and you take the best opportunities you can, and you try to enjoy your life, because you only live once. That's a mix of my history / my preaching from the pulpit. That's what I'll say.
I think that's great advice. Find what's fun. Find what's fun and do that. Okay, Karen, I think you touched a bit on this in your introduction, but why don't you tell us what made you look outside academia and industry?
Sure, and I got a bit sidetracked into evidence-based policy, and I forgot to say what I do now, which is I have my own consulting company, and the work that I do is focused on how do we accelerate communities towards a low-carbon future. So just to finish off the first question that you asked. And yeah, for me it was a bit of life circumstance. I'd had my son, I wanted to stay close to home, so there was this opportunity to work at an organization that I'd actually been volunteering with previously. And so it was a bit of life circumstance. I think though, listening to Daniel though, if I'm honest with myself, I wasn't liking where my postdoctoral fellowship was going. It was becoming very molecular, really in the lab, and I really liked my earlier work that was more out in the field. So I think there was a little bit of that going on, but at first it was just to be a 2-year leave of absence from my postdoctoral fellowship. The intent was to go back, but then once I got engaged in the community, I got hooked. And so 2 years turned into 10 years, and I was on city council. And so I think that whole path has just been taking opportunities. And when you have a chance to do something, even if it's beyond your comfort zone, you try it out and you see what it's like, and you see where it takes you. And that's really been my path like Hilary, I mean, I really haven't had the grand plan, and I guess the only plan I had when I was growing up was to be a veterinarian, and that's probably what took me to Guelph. But once I started getting into the lab and doing work and research, I got hooked onto that. So again, just sort of following, taking opportunities and following what looks really interesting and is going to engage you. Yeah.
I'm starting to see a trend here. Seems like everyone agrees. Take the opportunities when you can. And Daryl, do you want to finish us off with this? What made you look outside academia and industry?
Sure. So I can echo the other three in saying that my career path has been more of a bit of a meander than an actual plan. But it started for me in that I always, I do a lot of kind of artistic things on the side. I've always enjoyed being creative. And about halfway through my engineering degree, I sort of came to the realization that the career path that engineering was preparing me for, at the very least in my education, was not creative. So I started coming up with, okay, well, how do I kind of use this skill set, use this science that I'm enjoying learning, and apply it to creative things? And me and a couple friends started brainstorming on 15 years down the line, when we have some money saved up, we'll start a company and we'll just build fun stuff. And then that entire thing got accelerated by us sort of just taking a bit of a random opportunity to go visit an innovation center, so a company that helps startup companies happen. We talked to a few people there, one thing led to another, and instead of 15 years, within 1 year, we had our little startup designing and building cool stuff. And then since I sort of got that taste of sort of outside the other options that people may have not told you exist, I don't think I'm ever going to be capable of kind of going. Then I've been taking every strange opportunity that comes up. So I had the chance to do a TED Talk at one point, which started getting me interested in the communication of science and how can I involve more people in STEM, or how can I encourage more creativity in STEM. And that sort of led down certain career paths. The entrepreneurship aspect has led to the other startup. And sort of all of that has wound up fueling this desire for me to kind of stay outside the norm and keep doing areas that I feel I have passion in and that I feel I sort of have some creative control over what I'm doing. And that's been it. I wish I could give a set direction on here's how I made these choices, but it's been a meander of following my passions as best I can.
Great. And I think there's a lot of people in STEM who have a creative side to them as well. So STEM and art interconnections are a really interesting place to be too, I think. So we're going to move on to the next question. This is from Catherine, and she asks, what is your feeling for doing a standard job search versus knowing the right people and being in the right place at the right time? So does anyone want to speak to this question if you feel like you forgoed the job search for knowing people or vice versa?
I'll jump in if you'll let me. Certainly with science communication, my experience has been that it doesn't matter how nice your CV is, it doesn't matter how many publications you have, it doesn't matter where you went to school, none of that matters at all. It's just with the impression you make. And so if you want to, it used to be that there were like a couple of TV networks that if they gave you a job, you'd be the person on TV, but it doesn't work that way anymore. Now it's just the people who have talent sort of rise to the surface. And when we put together Daily Planet, we're fully aware that we're competing for the attention span of people that could go to a zillion different websites or YouTube channels for some of the same stuff. And so we try to partner with some of the really good producers of content to feature their stuff on our show and add to it. So if you want to be the science communicator, you sort of do it. You just sort of make your own YouTube channel and you get out there and you show that you have the ability, and then you also network. You also just are not shy. You approach people, you talk to them, and you sort of get on their radar. Being good on paper, taking one more master's course in this or another, just so that your CV looks really good, is not a good use of time. The only exception to that, from my experience, has been that they really like that I have a PhD. They love being able to call me Dr. Dan Riskin for a couple of shows that I do. Although for Daily Planet, they practically hide it. They don't like calling me Dr. Riskin. They don't like mentioning it. But for Monsters Inside Me, they definitely want that. And for the book, they liked having it on the cover. So So that's one little thing. But all the things that as an academic you think are the check marks you need to be hitting, those don't necessarily translate into this kind of real world job, if you can call TV real world. So that's what I'd say about that. I mean, really, you just got to be aggressive in sending emails and then meeting people for lunch and just being outward. And if that's not what you're comfortable with if you're not an extrovert and you feel like that's not what you want to do, it is like any other skill that you can teach yourself. And I have definitely spent a lot of time working on my skill set to be a better schmoozer for this job than I would be naturally. And so I'm happy to follow up on that if people have specific questions. But those are my thoughts there.
Great, thanks, Dan. Does anyone else want to jump in and give us their advice on this question?
Yeah, sure. I can just say that I can't recall ever doing a normal job search, so don't have much to share on that. I think what my path has been, it's being in the right place at the right time, I guess, but it's more because you've tried something, you've volunteered for something, or you've a door is open and you've gone through it. So it's not luck or serendipity as much as it is you're acting, you're taking action, and you're stepping through and you're doing something, or you're going to a meeting, or you're working with some people, and through that you meet people and then you learn about opportunities. And I think that's the best way, because you demonstrate who you are and where your passions are and where your skills are. And so I think that's what opens the opportunities up more than sort of a different path. And better than just feeling like you know the right people, it's that you've actually engaged with people and that they know you're the right person as opposed to knowing the right people, right? So.
Yeah, it's hard to show who you truly are on a resume or a CV. Better to show them in person.
I can add a couple of things as well if we have a moment.
Go right ahead.
Oh, thanks. And some of it is anecdotal and it's maybe not the best story, but when I think about 40 years ago working way up north, I was the first woman that was hired to go into a remote mining camp. And the way I got that job was my educational background, and I'm almost ashamed to say this, but it worked. Beer drinking at Oktoberfest in Kitchener-Waterloo. And it just turned out that the gentleman that was hiring for this position was at the same table. And so when he saw my resume come through a pile of resumes, recognized that there was somebody that could probably adapt to an environment where they're in somewhat isolation, and certainly there wasn't a lot of gender diversity in those days. So it was a very interesting start to my whole career, and it actually started drinking beer in Kitchener. So, it is a question, and Dan mentioned this right out of the chute. It's the personal relationships that you develop where somebody sees something in you. So that's an unusual way to start, and I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. But after that, there was never once where I actually had to apply for a job. So every job I've had since then has been through the network and the work that I've done with people, where then there's been another opportunity that's opened up. So I would say that when you're starting out and you're going through the resume process, and I've had a very traditional career, it's not as creative as many of the panel members here, but simply the resume and having to apply online is a very difficult sifting and sorting process for most people. But most universities will have industry and technical overlaps. So I know in Calgary, I participate in the Geology Society here with geology students from across the country and engineering students from across the country, and the industry and various industries host social events. And it is a chance to actually put a name to a face. And then if somebody is sending an email, I'm old-fashioned enough to hope that somebody will actually follow up with a phone call, because I get inundated, absolutely inundated with people looking for work. And it's very simple to sit at home and fire off a plethora of emails that aren't necessarily well thought out. but it takes a little bit more chutzpah to actually pick up the phone and leave a message and say, I sent you an email, you know, could you take a look and maybe give me a shout back, or happy to take you for a coffee. But it's just that extra effort that will differentiate one email from another.
Great, thanks, Hilary. I know many a good science conversation has started over beers, so it's maybe not the worst place to start. But definitely career centers at universities are also good resources for students.
I can make it 4 for 4 on this question if we want. Why not?
Go for it.
Yeah, and again, you know, similar to what the other 3 panelists are saying is I don't think I've ever done a traditional job search since high school. And what that's wound up being is I've built sort of 3 kind of personal rules for myself on how to create opportunities and take advantage of them. And absolutely none of them are building my CV. I think I've touched it maybe once in the past 2 or 3 years. And it's largely because a lot of the skills that seem to be valued for these opportunities are not necessarily your technical skills. And, you know, Dan was kind of saying the same thing. It's sort of the soft skills and the things that you can present in conversation and in actively working with people and in those sort of relationships. It's the networks you build. And when I say networking, I don't mean going to conferences and handing everyone your business card. I mean building actual sort of meaningful relationships with that person, those extra steps like calling them to go for coffee, or perhaps giving them a bit of advice on a project or something like that. It's always been those opportunities that have opened doors for me in the future, and it's always been those opportunities that have led to the most interesting and non-traditional outcomes. And then the other one I can add is just sort of be impulsive with the opportunities that come up. So a good example being I decided to throw myself into a 48-hour challenge to try and build a video game, which is something I've never done before. But it seemed like fun, and why not? And since then, I've met about 20 to 30 people all in this industry that I've never worked in before, who are now kind of throwing different projects my way or throwing potential new ideas and trying to open doors. Whether or not I go down that path is a different question, but it's still far more effective than I think it's ever been if I've sent my resume out. Because it's too easy for your resume to sort of get buried in the pile. You want to try and stand out and be memorable, and networking, your soft skills, and sort of impulsive putting yourself out there can be some really, really valuable ways of doing it.
It's great advice. Thank you, everyone. So the next question we're going to go to is for Dan, and this is from Connie. She asks, what would you recommend for someone who wants to continue science research but also write scripts or find a way to present science in a fun, engaging way, whether it's through writing or an organized event? And are there ways to find opportunities for that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm working in a building in Toronto where Discovery Canada is, but also TSN, the sports network, and CTV Toronto local news, but also CTV national news. And so this building is full of people who do news. And so if you're a news producer, you get to work and you have a set number of hours before content that you've made appears on the air. And it's like a panic, right? It's like, what am I going to find? And of course you have your boss who's telling you, we're interested in this, we need to get something about that. But you're looking for that interesting thing that nobody else has, that people are everybody around you is gonna say, wow, how'd you find that? And scientists live in that stuff. So one great place to build relationships, if you are a scientist working in a city or near a city, is to build relationships with somebody who works in local news or national news if you're in a big city. And talk to them about what kind of stuff they're interested in, what they might look for. Because one of the great things about my day is I go through makeup. That's the best part of my day, is going through makeup. No, but when I go through makeup, Lisa LaFlamme is often sitting there. And so I have an opportunity to just say something like, hey, are you all over this business about the rocket launch that's going to happen tomorrow? Because it's kind of a big deal. And then if she's curious about it, or her producers are curious, then I'm the person that they come to because I've already planted the seed. And as a scientist, working as a scientist, you can have that relationship with media. So that's one place you can go. A second thing you can do is outreach to schools. Schools love nothing more than having somebody come and talk to their class. And when I was a grad student, I got a ton of my training as a science communicator just by giving talks about bats to school classes, and you give talk to grade ones, you give it to high school students, and you change your talk depending on who you're going to be talking to, and you learn how to work a crowd, and you learn how to deal with a crowd that's not going to listen to you if you're not interesting, which could apply to either of those age groups. But I got a lot of great experience that way. So one of my goals when I was going to be setting up as a prof at that university was that all my students were going to be giving talks in the community. And what Brock Fenton did for me is, and for all the students in his lab, is he said, here's all my slides. Pick any ones you want. I'll give you copies, which is even easier now because you just take the, the file. And I'm not going to tell you how to make your talk. Just go do it. And so just as a scientist, seeing yourself as a part of the community that shares the glory of science, that is something that you can do, that I would do, that I recommend doing. And yeah, and then the other piece is just not to feel like you're imposing on, I'm sorry, school, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do some really fascinating research. And if it's not too much trouble, I really would love to tell your students, they eat it up. They really appreciate when scientists are sharing. And the news, it's the same thing. And in the process, you can decide whether you're really comfortable being on TV or on the radio and talking about science, or if that's something that you want to delegate to somebody else, if you want to be behind the scenes. But those are all conversations for down the road. I think as scientists, we have a better opportunity than we realize, and increasingly with God help us what's happening in the States, and God help us what was happening in Canada with the previous government, we have a responsibility as scientists to engage the community so that our communities will never elect people that can dismiss science like that. It's not acceptable, and it's our fault as scientists for the fact that everybody doesn't love us is because we're doing something wrong. It's on us. So anyway, that's the sort of other end of it.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, students are always excited to see a new face in the classroom. They get to see their teacher every day, so guests are always nice. And in our volunteer training, we do have tips on how to engage with different ages and audiences. So if you're looking for tips on how to reach certain ages, you can talk to your coordinators about that, and they'll be able to help you. So we've got another question from Catherine here. She asks, where is the line between confidence and being pushy? For example, if you've applied for a job, at what point, if any, should you follow up with the recruiter, and how many times should you follow up? Maybe Hilary, you can take this one because you had already mentioned a little bit about following up with a phone call.
Mm-hmm. That's a very personal choice. I guess my philosophy in doing what I've done and how I've gone about it throughout my career has been to gain trust and push enough that the door opens a little bit, and then hopefully you get invited in. It's not been to break down the door. So everybody is going to think about that differently and have a different approach and a different plan. For me, the environment that I've been in, the industries that I've been in, it seems to have worked. I tend to be personally a little bit more sensitive to the person that is nagging if it gets to the point where I feel like that. So it's really know your audience. I think that's the best response, is know your audience. Some of the younger people that I work with, they look at that persistence as being a very, very good quality. I think if it's a postponement of a decision, it's great to continue to follow up and show interest. If the opportunity simply isn't there, periodically to check back and see if the circumstances have changed, I also think is fair. But if it becomes a daily obsession, then it really actually is not going to do you any good. So I don't think that there's, for me, a clear answer on that, but it is know the person that you're approaching and know them well enough to be able to sort out what the message is that you're getting back, rather than a clear, stop calling or, the persistent side of things. So to me, there's a big personal skill associated with assessing what situation you're dealing with.
It's great advice. Anyone else who's maybe done a little bit of hiring or sees resumes come across their desk want to chime in on this one?
I would just add that it does take a little bit of you practicing, right? So, really, So you do have to have the confidence, you know, not to talk yourself out of following up on everything, but, you know, to try something and then, you know, listen for the signs and learn from that. Just as Hilary was saying, knowing your audience, but you have to try to learn, you have to put yourself out there to learn what your audience is looking for. Daniel sort of talked about that, about going out and going into classrooms. I mean, it's where you can practice and test and be prepared to fail and like totally not engage that class, or really you get a very cold response from the person that you've called back, but learn from that. And then take that a little, you know, and incorporate that moving forward. So you do need a little bit of confidence to put yourself, I would describe it as comfortably beyond your comfort zone, so that you get to test some things out for yourself.
Great. Okay, so we'll move on to another question. This came from Catherine from our live chat. She asks, what's your opinion on getting a field-specific master's versus diving right into a field? For example, she's interested in a science communication master's, but is it really necessary? Is there someone who'd like to take this question?
I can comment on that. And the experience that I've had, I think, shows value in both. So it's not going to be maybe as helpful as we would like. So my background is a general geology background. So there's a specialty associated with that, but I did not do a master's. And I have a very, very strong and use daily financial skills, but I did not do an MBA. So it's really a question of how you learn those specialties, and there's lots of avenues for doing that are outside of a purely degree conforming process. So I think it depends on, you know, the educational background that you have and this, you know, the specialty that you're interested in, but it doesn't, in my view, have to be a purely academic path. Having said that, my youngest daughter is also a geologist, and she has an MSc very specifically in a very kind of focused area of the science, and it's based on Arctic configuration of the rocks up in the Arctic. And interestingly enough, that was a very important element in her getting her first job. So I think that between the two of us, although we're both geologists by background, we've had different pathways, and she's early in her career yet, but that very specific master's program was very helpful in her getting her first job. So, you know, it's one where I guess I'm offering that there is no answer that is black and white from my perspective, and it is very much opportunity driven, and what you're willing to do as further education, so in furtherance of your degree if there's specific requirements.
Great. Yeah, it's probably a little bit too about how you can identify the skills that you've gotten from the degrees that you've earned as well. Okay, so we've got another question from Ethan, and he asks, even today, supervisors expect their graduate students to continue a career in research, preferably in academia, despite the growing number of graduates unable to or not necessarily interested in a career in research. What suggestions do you have for current grad students who want a non-traditional career to convince or at least gain a tacit understanding from their supervisor that they are not wasting their degree? Does anyone have some advice for Ethan?
This seems like the kind of place where I give different advice than I would actually follow, but I'd be like, that's your supervisor's problem. I mean, you have to have a working relationship with your supervisor. You are going to need reference letters from them, so you don't want to completely insult them if their belief system suggests that an academic career is better than a non-traditional one. But you know, less than half of PhDs go on to become academics. And, you know, people talk about it as though people who aren't professors have fallen off some kind of true path. And that paradigm's changing, but a lot of the old guard hasn't caught up yet, hasn't really faced what the job market is like right now. So I think I mean, it's an individual relationship that you have to get certain things out of, right? To be at war with your advisor is not a good place to be. And, you know, the truth is you may not really totally know where you're going to head anyway. So the conversation doesn't have to be so black and white. But one thing that I came across, and this, I thought about mentioning this earlier when it was about how to endear yourself to people that you want to get a job from or that you want to network with. And one way you can endear yourself to your advisor is to ask for their advice and then follow their advice. It's been shown that this is a great way to manipulate people into liking you, is to ask them, and you know what, maybe their advice is good anyway, but if you go to somebody that you're trying to impress and you say, hey, you know what, I'm stuck on this one thing that you have expertise in, what do you suggest I do with this? And then the next time you see them, you follow up, you say, hey, I did exactly what you said and it really helped in these ways. So maybe you go to your advisor and you say, look, I am trying to get academic positions. I know that that's, you know, one of the places this goes, but I'm trying to keep my options open. You know, I have a family that I'm trying to take care of, or whatever your situation, and ask them what they would do. And that might be a way to start the conversation and get them seeing things maybe a little bit from your perspective. But ultimately, it's not your responsibility to be the therapist to your advisor just because all their students don't become profs. That's just their problem, and they're just not facing the way the world works. And again, that's easy advice to give, very tough advice to take, but that's the advice I'm giving, because I have a great relationship with my advisor who happens not to care that I'm not an academic. So he always believed my job is to get you a job, and that was where it ended. So the fact that I have a job, he feels like he got done what he needed to do.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to knowing your audience again, doesn't it? Okay, let's ask, here's a question about online and social media from Valerie. This is from our online chat. And Valerie asks, how important do you think social media is for pursuing a career in science outside of the traditional pathways? And do you have any advice on creating a greater online presence if that is important? So anybody involved with the social media sphere want to contribute to this question?
I mean, I can try from my perspective. Simply, I'm not very good at social media. I go through these periods where, like, for a week or two, I'm excellent at it, and you know, consistently gaining new followers or something like that. And then I go through periods where, like, for months, I just don't touch it. I have not found it to be particularly effective as a tool for my career, nor have I found it to be particularly a negative if I don't have that sort of social media presence. Where it is valuable, however, is it is valuable in trying to make those important networks happen a little bit faster. Social media is a great way of kind of identifying, as we were saying, identifying your audience, making some of those early connections, getting some of that information you need to really build a important and useful relationship in a network that can open doors for you, can give you a job, can do all of these things. But it's not based on your presence. It's more based on kind of using it as an additional information hub. Yeah, other than that, it's not affected too much of what I do. Trying to ensure that if you are doing things that you find interesting or that you are passionate about, things have some kind of online presence, so you can at least point people in the right direction. So I can say, oh, I did this thing a couple years ago. Yeah, here's a link if you want to check it out. And even if it's not a social media post, it's a good way of sort of sharing almost your portfolio, basically. It's sort of digitizing your portfolio. I'm not too sure if my experience can apply to the rest of the panel because I think I'm probably the least popular one on social media here, but let's hear from them.
Anyone else have some social media stories to share? There's definitely good communities on social media, and it's probably a resource that you can use. Hilary, do you have something to add?
Yeah, you know what? I'll make two comments. One of them is, again, it's one of my sons-in-law is very involved in social media. It's an advertising relationship that he has with with a number of very large Canadian corporations that are in the business of selling product. And so the advertising component of social media has become, you know, a much, much greater face. So it depends on what kind of business that you're in. If you're in the business of selling product, then you have to be engaged in social media. And we're finding that people are tuning out of television. So the traditional methods of advertising, except maybe for the Super Bowl coming up on the weekend, are becoming less and less popular source of information for consumers. So when there's a selling or there's a consumer relationship, social media has got to be a huge part of what you're thinking about. And then the second thing I would say, and this is something that's maybe less relevant to people who are listening in, from the board of directors perspective, so when you're looking at the oversight and the governance of companies, social media is actually very important. And we saw what happened with a single tweet when the share price of one of the largest corporations in North America, arguably in the world, share price dropped dramatically with a tweet. So the responsibility that corporations bear if they don't have some control over the information that's being disseminated about their company is absolutely critical. So billions of dollars are gained and lost with misinformation that comes from social media. So large corporations today and their boards of directors have to be looking at the risk associated with all of the avenues that are used for social media, and the solid fact-based information as well as the misinformation. So it's something that has to be on everybody's mind if they're responsible for a company in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I will say also, public communication, I'm expected to have a Twitter account for work. I'm expected to engage people over social media, and I do try to do that. But I'm also aware of the fact that no tweet is ever going to get me anything except retweets, which have no value, or more followers, which has questionable value. But any tweet could get me fired and could end my career. So I have a rule that if I have had one sip of alcohol, Twitter is off limits completely. I'm terrified that I would make some kind of silly mistake to have an opinion that I thought was benign and realize the next morning was not. So even if I've had one sip of beer, and I'm scared of, I have a healthy fear of social media, but I think a lot of people in the audience watching this are younger than I am and have grown up with it and are more comfortable with it and take those risks more in stride. And it's up to you to have your own relationship with that stuff. I see it as maybe more fraught with danger than other people might. But I also think social media can take up all your attention span and can prevent you from working on long-term projects. And that's something that I've battled with, certainly since I've been here at Discovery, really engaging people on Twitter and being part of communities and having conversations. But it takes me away from working on a book. And if you're in academics, you've worked on long-term projects, you know that you have to do the work months in if you want to have a finished product at the end. And social media, it seems to be something in my life that works against that. So that's why that's one of the reasons that I try to keep it in moderation.
I think that's great advice. Find a balance and keep it in moderation.
There was just one more comment I wanted to make along those lines, and with Karen in the call here, I'm sure that this would resonate with her, but when we had some new government officials that took over during a provincial election, and they were relatively young and inexperienced, Facebook ended up being the demise of their very short political career. And so it is something that, to Dan's point, you really do have to cut yourself off and not react quickly and look at the position and their level of responsibility and who will be looking at that Facebook page. And sometimes it's beyond your, quote unquote friends.
Yeah, I would just add that you really need to know why you're using it. And I think some of the comments have been around that. So be really clear about why, and just because someone else uses it for this reason, that might not be useful to you. And I think the real challenge for people who have a public role is discerning, and there isn't this discernment in social media. You're one and the same. Your personal and your professional are together. But that's not how the world works and how your jobs work. So I think it becomes, even more difficult if you've got a very big public role, in being able to walk that line between that personal and professional, and being scared about tripping over into the personal when you should be staying professional is probably a pretty healthy way to be, to avoid the risk of making a mistake.
Yeah, that's all really great advice. Unfortunately, we've only got a few minutes remaining, so I want to just give each of our panelists one more chance to get out a short piece of advice or an interesting story that you'd like to share with our volunteers. So we'll just go in the same order as we've been going. So Hilary, do you have any last pieces of advice you'd like to share?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit that I've learned from all the other panelists as well. I mean, Dan talked about having fun, and Daryl talked about the creativeness, and Karen talked about, being open to changes, and everybody had some combination or permutation of that. I think that there is also just the practicality that when you're starting out, you need to have a job. And, to the extent that people can be really, really selective, I applaud you. But the reality is any experience that you can get when you're starting out is going to be very helpful to you in the long run. And no particular job is a life sentence. It is a learning, it's more relationships, it's more understanding of what you enjoy doing. And that refinement is something that goes on over a lifetime. I'm sitting 40 years into my career, and a lot of people would be saying, well, there's no way I want to be working in 40 years. But when it's something that you enjoy doing and you're being impactful, and you're able to make some choices, it's a very rewarding thing. So a career is a lifetime today, whereas years and years ago it wasn't. And so I just think it's a matter of accepting challenge and learning. And I do believe that it's in the downside that you learn the most. And so, if there is, a hit that you take along the way to pull up your socks and keep going, you'll learn more through that than you do every success. And then the last comment I want to really quickly make is that you need to be an honest and ethical person. At the end of the day, you'll see lots of people who are able to succeed with less than, pristine records of truth. And, my view is that sticking to the ethics and the morality of who you are and being genuine to that is worth a multitude of different opportunities and so-called rewards.
Great, thanks, Hilary. Dan, would you like to go next with the last piece of advice?
Sure. I will say, Hilary, that was beautiful words there. I really, that resonates very much. So thank you for that. And what I'm going to say is just tagging on to that when you're doing science, you're always learning things, and you're always trying to learn something nobody's learned before. And so the audience that's listening knows that. And when I was a kid, I really thought that there would be some point where I'd learned enough that I didn't have to be on that learning curve anymore. And I was just going to know all the things you need to know, and then I wouldn't have to keep learning stuff. And somewhere along the way, you realize that it never stops, and that there's actually joy in learning more. And in that vein, as you grow as a person, as you go in your career, being outside your comfort zone is the only way to grow, right? If you are always doing something that you already know how to do, and you just sort of try to find that comfortable place where you're not going to grow anymore, you're doing yourself a disservice. And you already know that from your science backgrounds, so you need to be in. So it's very important to ask yourself if there's a way you can get out of your comfort zone and grow as a person. And so for me, it was writing that book that I mentioned, doing this podcast, which I also mentioned, and thank you for your kind words, but that is not something I know how to do very well. And every time I listen to one, I can hear a million things I need to do differently. And I'm constantly looking for new ways to grow and new things to do, because it's rewarding and it's really nice. So, and you're going to make mistakes and you're going to fail. And that doesn't mean anything went wrong. It's just like a failed experiment. It's totally par for the course. And so that's all. I encourage people to try to do that. And that's something I try to live by as well.
Great, thanks, Dan. Karen, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, all of those have been great messages to end off on. So I echo everything that's been said. And I think if you take those messages and the people that are listening are engaged in the sciences, that wherever you end up, you will be bringing value. And so if it's a traditional field or a non-traditional area, you will bring value. So go forth and take science out into the world.
Great, thanks, Karen. And Daryl, would you like the last word? Oh, Daryl, I think you're on mute if you want to come off mute. Thanks.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, so I'm gonna quickly share the 3 rules. And Dan touched on the first one, which is always be learning new things. Everyone has this big list of skills or things that they'd like to learn one day if they have the time. Stop putting it off, just start making your way through that list. It doesn't matter if you think it's a relevant skill set to what you do or not, just you'll be amazed at the things that come from learning new stuff. And try and do so socially. Find someone who has more experience in it than you, invite them out for coffee and try and pick their brain. There was a question about mentors, that's how you make them. That's also how you build your network. The rule 2 for me is build and nurture a network. So like, you know, nurture those relationships, take on personal projects with people, give them some advice, help them out in small ways, invite them out for coffee or phone calls, stuff like that. And then, you know, use and capitalize on the things that come from that network. And then 3 is be impulsive, take risks. You're not going to do much if you don't put yourself out there. So those strange opportunities that come up and you think, oh, that might be fun, and then never look at it again, actually do those, follow up on them, and you'll be amazed at the sort of things that pop up from there. And then just stick with your passions. That's kind of the easiest way to summarize it. If you're passionate and interested about something, it's infectious.
Thanks, Daryl. So channel your inner Shia LaBeouf and just do it. Just do the things. So that looks like all the time. Yeah, looks like all we have time for today. So I want to thank all of our panelists for taking time out of your day to chat with us. This is really great. And I think our volunteers got some really great advice today. Also, thank you to everyone who joined us on the live stream and submitting your questions. We will post some of the questions to our panelists after the fact. So keep an eye on your inbox for our volunteer newsletter, and you might see some of the answers to your questions there. I just want to remind any volunteers watching that we'd love to get your feedback on this career panel, so please follow the link in the description to the video to the survey, and we'll try to take your suggestions and improve on any future events we have. If you know of anyone that wasn't able to join us today, the video will be posted at the same link that you used to get connected today. So you can share that link with your friends or just come back and watch it again when you find that you're looking for career advice. So thanks again to everybody, and stay tuned for more professional development events being offered through Let's Talk Science. And we'll say goodbye. Thanks for joining us.